What's up, friends? We are back for another episode of Couch Chats with Hannah Rose. I am super excited about what I'm going to be talking about today. So yeah, let's dig in. I shared this on my Instagram story a few days ago, but I was talking about this devotional that I've been doing. It's meant to be like one day, like one little devotional a day, because there's like 31 in here. But I've been going through it so slowly because I've been doing each day for a week. I've just found that I retain so much more, and so many more things have the opportunity to stand out to me. And so I have discovered so far, I think, my favorite day of this devotional, which is day 15. And you're going to hear the title of this chapter and you're going to be like, Hannah Rose, why is that your favorite? I'm going to be like, let me tell you. So this chapter is titled, it's day 15, From Suffering to Glory, and it is based on the verse from John 11:40 that says, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And so this chapter specifically is talking about the story of Lazarus. And yeah, there's just a bunch in it, so I'm excited to dig into it. So I guess I'll just start by talking about, before I talk about the chapter, let's talk about what's happening in the scripture. So obviously this is the account of how Lazarus had died and Jesus came and he rose him from the dead. But whenever the chapter is looking at this story, it is looking at the suffering that we experience this side of heaven, and how that experience, how suffering brings about the glory of the Father. And so yeah, okay, great, let's jump in, I guess, from there. Sorry, I've been thinking about how I wanted to go about this, and there are, like, I guess so many different ways that I could jump into this, and it's just been hard to decide what exactly I felt like I was supposed to share and where to start. But when you're reading the chapter, it starts off by setting the scene for you, and it brings up the opening verse of John 11. And so basically the opening verse of John 11 is talking about how Lazarus is ill, and so Mary and Martha call for Jesus, and they're like, Jesus, the one that you love, he's sick, we need you, you gotta come. And it's really interesting because Jesus's response, if you look at it, it says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And they actually talk about this in the devotional, but it's so interesting that is Jesus' response. It says, Jesus loved, so he stayed right where he was. And it's very interesting that that's the response, because, when we're looking at it from a fleshly perspective, we're like, that's not how I would write that story, right? If it were you and I, if we wrote that story, we would say Jesus loved, and so he ran to go and heal Lazarus, and yeah, like that's how we would write it. We wouldn't, if we could pick, we wouldn't endure that suffering, we wouldn't endure that hardship. And so the thing that I've just been coming back to all week is Jesus' response in that moment was motivated out of love, not indifference. And if you know anything about the Father, you know that that's what a lot of his actions are motivated out of. Not a lot, it's all of his actions are motivated out of. It's out of his love. But when you're looking at those two statements, they don't seem to fit together. And so that was just something that I had to keep in my mind of, like, there's a bigger picture here. So you see, Jesus stayed where he was, and eventually Jesus comes, and again, there are some more things that I find interesting. So Jesus gets there, and you know, he's on his way, and Mary and Martha realize that he's coming. And so Martha runs to Jesus, and she's like, Jesus, like, if you had just been here, he wouldn't be dead. But even now, I know that you are capable of healing him if that's what you want to do. If that's, the Lord's will. And so, he responds and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she says, yes. And so, then Martha goes back and she's like, hey, Jesus is here. So Mary comes out. And I find it so interesting because when Mary comes out, she again says, Lord, if you've been here, then he wouldn't have died. And it's the next response that's super interesting because Jesus, when he sees her weeping, is moved. So it says, Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping. And he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And so Jesus went, and it was in that moment that Jesus wept. And again, just a really interesting response because Jesus knew what the outcome was going to be. Jesus knew that Lazarus was going to be raised. He knew that glory was going to be brought to the Lord. And still, he didn't rush past their pain in that moment. Jesus could have gotten there and he could have explained 500 ways to Sunday why it was that he delayed. He could have been like, hey guys, I know how this story ends, it's fine, quit crying. He could have brushed past that, and that's not what you see. Instead, you see he enters into their pain. It deeply matters to him, and he acknowledges their pain, and he sits with them in their pain before he does anything else. And so a really good point that the book made, or that the book talked about when we're looking at this verse, is it says, when we're facing the prospect of lifelong pain or the possibility of final separation from a beloved friend, it's easy to think that we know what would best glorify God. When it's my pain or loss, I think that God's glory would be seen most clearly in my immediate deliverance. But when I look at this story and so many others, I see something different. And I've kind of sat with this, for the last week, and I've been thinking there are situations, I think, in all of our lives where we're going through something hard and we're like, gosh, Jesus, why don't you move in this way? Why don't you do deliverance in this way? Why haven't you set me free in this way? And a lot of times, at least I don't know for you, I know for me this is true. A lot of times it's because I think, well, this is what's going to bring the most glory to the Lord. Jesus, you would be so glorified if this was just instant, if there was instant deliverance, if there was instant healing, if there was instant freedom. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely do think that brings glory to the Lord, but I think what I've come to realize over the last week, just sitting with this chapter and this section of scripture, and even just meditating on some of the things that I've seen throughout my own life, is that the characteristics of the Father and the God that we come to know in suffering is such a greater testimony than we ever give credit to, I think. And so, Jesus absolutely could bring instant deliverance. He could bring instant healing, and that would be miraculous, and it would certainly bring glory to the Father. But sometimes there's something that we learn in the trenches of suffering, because the truth is that when we're in suffering, we aren't sitting in it alone. the Father is sitting in it with us. And so, yeah, that's just been super powerful this week to me, to think like every time I'm sitting in suffering, I am learning things about the Father that I couldn't learn any other way. And typically those things, those lessons that we learn in suffering, become the ones that stick with us the most. And, as I was thinking, just even like when it comes to the testimony that we're able to give to other people, I started thinking, there are testimonies that you give them. And if you're giving a testimony to somebody in the midst of suffering, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's phenomenal to look at them and say, yeah, like I prayed and instantaneously there was deliverance, instantaneously there was freedom. But when you're speaking with somebody who's suffering, to be able to come alongside them and say, yeah, this is hard, this is difficult, and let me tell you the ways that I've seen God show up in the midst of this exact suffering. I think it begins to speak to something so much deeper and so much grander than what we could imagine. And so, yeah, that's kind of where that chapter has landed with me this week. And then she does a prayer at the end of some of these chapters. And so there was 2 lines that really stood out to me in her prayer, and that I've kept coming back to this week as I've read, and I've kind of tried to meditate on throughout the day. And the first one is, she says, I pray that in your grace you would remind me that you're here and that you're working towards a better good than I could ever imagine. When we're in the midst of suffering, I think it's easy to feel like the Lord has forgotten us, or he's forsaken us, or that he's not present in that moment. But scripture promises he is in that very moment with us. And just the reminder that he's working towards a better good than I could imagine brings so much comfort even in the midst of suffering. And then the other line that she's got in this prayer, she says, help me to believe that your glory is worth this suffering, just as you knew that my seeing it was worth yours. And so just that reminder of, not only is he with me in my present suffering, but he went through his own suffering so that he could be with me in this moment. So yeah, I guess all of that to say, I don't know what your suffering is. I don't know what hardship you're facing. I don't know what circumstances you're up against right now, but the Lord does, and he is not indifferent to your pain. He is not ignoring your pain. He is not callous or looking the other way. He is with you, and he is working towards a better good. And so I hope that this has been an encouragement to you, and I love you, and I'll see you soon.